Okay, so this video is guided towards those people that don't know nothing about phones, like for example, grandmothers, grandfathers, and Mika, who gave me the idea to do this video. So let's begin. Today I'm going to talk about what I mean by everything I say when I'm doing a review of a phone. Let's begin. So first thing I talk about is hardware and all the things that we can see on the outside of the phone, and things that I usually don't know where else to put. For example, I talk about what material every phone is built of. This is pretty self-explanatory. Some are built of metal, some are built of glass, some are built of plastic. And I'll talk about the quality, or at least I like to. Sometimes I forget to, but I usually talk about the quality of a phone. If you drop it, how likely is it to break, and all that kind of stuff. Then I talk about, for example, what resistance it has. Our phone can be splash resistant, or it can be water repellent, or it can be water resistant directly, in which case it usually has a certification that is either IP68 or IP67 or something by those means. When we say IP6, refers to dust resistant, to the level of dust resistance that it has. And nearly all the phones that are water and dust resistant are IP60 something. And then 67, for example, means that it can be, I think it was half a meter underwater for either less than or half an hour. And IP68, I think, now I don't remember really, but I think it meant something like that. If it's half a meter underwater, it can be for more than half an hour, or something by those likes. Doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that it is water and dust resistance. You can always check up the specifications, the real good specifications on the internet. Okay, so I'm recording this outside and with another woozer, not because I had an epiphany about what a great video director should be, but because I forgot to talk about this yesterday. So another thing what I talk about is the display of a phone, no? And when I talk about the display, I talk about the first how many inches it has, how many inches the screen has, which is just inches, which is an American measure that you take in diagonal. You measure the inches in diagonal of a screen, and then you know how many inches a phone has, how many inches the screen of a phone has. And then there's the aspect ratio, which started being something very important now, because we always had a 16:9, which is the normal aspect ratio on monitors or TV screens or so on. But now we're starting to have a lot of phones, most of them actually, that are 18:9 or 19.5:9, which basically means that the screen might be the same, might have the same wideness, but it's longer. So on the same surface of a phone, you have more screen than before, which is a good thing. So normally when it's 19.5:9 or 18:9, it's in a way better, because it means you have more screen than if you have 16:9. So then I talk about the definition, which is the same as with video. You have full HD or quad HD, which would be 2K instead of 4K. Many of the high-end phones have 2K or quad HD displays. Many of them have full HD displays, and the ones that are lower end usually have 720p displays. That would be HD displays. So there's definition, there's aspect ratio, there's how many inches the screen has, and then nowadays, since a lot of them have a higher aspect ratio, they can't have just a normal rectangle for a screen, but a lot of times they have a notch on the part of on top usually, which houses the camera, a speaker maybe, or something by those means. And some of them have what's called a drop tier notch, which is just a small notch that you can barely see. Some of them have a normal notch, which is the one that the iPhones have, for example. Then some of them, like the Samsung Galaxy S10, have I don't know how it's called, an eye notch or something like that, let's call it. And some, like the OnePlus 7, don't have a notch, but they have a mechanism that houses the camera that's hidden behind the phone, and it opens only when you want to take a photo or a video with the front camera. So that's it for displays, I think. And I can't seem to get it right, so here's this one One thing that I forgot to say about screens, a lot of times I talk about PPI, which is pixels per inch, and the way you measure this is you get the definition of a screen. Let's say it's 1280 by 720, and then you multiply those two numbers, you multiply 1280 by 720, and then you divide it by the number of inches that the screen of a phone has. And then you get a number, usually of 3 digits, which gives you the PPI of a screen of the screen of a phone. And this is the really important number, because phones a lot of times, again, Sony, for example, likes to brag about how they have 4K, or how they used to have 4K displays on their phones. But this is really not very useful if you have a phone that has from 5 to 6 inches. So what really matters more than the definition a lot of times is just the pixel density, because the higher the pixel density, the less you're going to notice, or the better the definition is going to look like. So that's a very important thing to have into account. So then I don't know if I talk about this afterwards. I talk about, let's call it hardware, but I do talk about the cameras because I have to, obviously. And I talk about the rear and the front camera. The rear camera has some specifications, like, for example, megapixels. When you talk about megapixels, you talk about how much can you zoom into a photo before really noticing the pixels and the well, not really the pixels, but the granulado. You would say in Spanish granulado. I don't know what the word is in English. So how much you can zoom in before you notice the granulado of an image. So, for example, once on Reddit I saw a picture that was taken with a camera that had, I think, 48 or 60 or 80 megapixels, yeah, and it was a photo of the moon, and it had such a high megapixel count that you could zoom in and you could see the craters of the moon perfectly. So this is what megapixel refers to. Normally phones nowadays have 12 megapixels, although there's some crazy phones that have 48 megapixels, but for example the Redmi Note 7 that I was investigating this phone a time ago has a camera with 48 megapixels, but if this is not well handled with software, it's useless. For example, the processor of the Redmi Note 7 can't handle 48 megapixels that well, and it's not very well managed with software. And for example, Sony phones are well known for having, or ex-Sony phones are well known for having high megapixel count, like 20 megapixels or things like that. But even then, you zoom in and you can see the image worse than what you would be able to see it with a phone that has 12 megapixels. So a lot of times, people in Compumundo or Musimundo, those type of places, like talking to you about how many megapixels a camera phone has, as a way of telling you that that is a good camera phone, and it is not the case. Megapixels is not everything. What yes is important, for example, is the aperture. Aperture is usually, when I talk about the aperture, I say that it has f1.8 or f2.4 or something by those means, and usually the lower the number of the aperture, the more light can come in, but the less differentiation you have between foreground and background. So that's where there's phones like the Galaxy S9 that have a variable aperture. It had, I think, 1.7 and 2.4. You could use 1.7 in situations where you need the light, and then situations that already have a lot of light and you prefer having really the detail and the differentiation between foreground and background, you could choose 2.4, and then you would have a better, in sort of a way, better definition. Then there's color reproduction, which has usually a lot to do with software and how each company handles that. For example, Pixel is well known for having very good post-image processing, and this is one of the things that make it one of the best, or the best phone camera-wise. And that's, if I don't recall badly, that's all what has to do with photos. Then I talk about video, which video has different definitions. You have Full HD, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels, but it says 1080p, which stands for progressive, which is something that doesn't matter. I'm not going to talk about that now. It could be 720, for example, which would be 280 or 1280, by 720 pixels, or 4K. Usually good cameras, high-end cameras can record until 4K, but nowadays with the technology that we have, 1080p is more than enough for most of the cameras, I would say. Then we have OIS, which would be optical image stabilization, or EYS, which is EYS, yeah, electrical image stabilization. Was it that, or was it digital? DYS. I don't remember if it was electrical image stabilization or digital image stabilization, but either way, one is handled by software and one is handled by hardware. One has like a small gimbal in the camera, which you would be able to see if you would get the back part out of the camera, which in a way helps you when you are running or something like that, for the image to be more stable when you're recording. The best one is the optical, because it does it the best, just because, and digital tries to do its best, but it's all with calculations and not really with a physical thing that's helping you. So always when you can, you would choose one with optical image stabilization. And there's phones of lower degree that don't even have none of these two. So with that I think I covered everything what has to do with cameras. Now let's talk about processors. Processors in phones. Processors aren't just CPUs like in computers, they are directly SoCs, which means system of a chip, which means it has the GPU, the CPU, and other things that are, for example, handle image processing and things that computers don't always have to do. So SoCs that are very well known nowadays are the ones of Qualcomm, the ones of Exynos. Qualcomm is a company by ARM that produces SoCs for not nearly all of them, but a lot of Android phones. Then we have Exynos, which is a brand of Samsung that does processors or SoCs just for Samsung and just for the European version of Samsung, because Qualcomm is a American company. Then we have MediaTek, which is I think an Asian company, which does usually lower end processors for Asia, for Asian phones. Then we have the Kirin's that are by Huawei. Although Huawei might be dead in a couple of days. That's another story. So the process, and then obviously we have the A chips by Apple, no? So then Apple chips are usually the A12 by, nowadays, for example, we have the A12 Bionic, A11, I don't remember the marketing name, but A11 something. Then when we talk about Qualcomm, we have, this is easy to know because basically the higher the number, the better the processor. We have, for example, the 660, which is a mid-high-end processor. We have the 845, sorry. Qualcomm Snapdragon 845, Qualcomm Snapdragon 414, which is a really low-end one, and so on. But here it's very easy to know. You just have to know that the higher the number, as long as it's three numbers, a three-digit number, the higher the number, the better the processor. And then inside of the processor, what's important is the core count and the clock speed more than anything. The core count counts how many cores it has, so each core helps the processor to do a process, and the more cores you have, the quicker it goes, but it's not everything. Some apps take better advantage of many cores and some take less advantage of many cores. Then the other thing that's important is the clock speed. So then, going back to cores, sorry, a lot of phones nowadays, high-end phones, have octa-core processors. Even a lot of mid-end phones have octa-core processors, but for example, on computers, a 4-core processor is normal, and it is still better than most of the 8-core processors that we have in phones, because they have higher clock speed. Each core has a higher clock speed. The clock speed is measured in gigahertz, which is giga stands for billion and hertz stands for times per second. So when you have, for example, 1.8 gigahertz, which is a common number for mid to mid high end phones, you have 1.8 billion times per second that the processor is doing a certain operation. It's a high number, I know. So then many of these phones, what they do, they have, if they're octa-core, they have 4 cores that run at 1.8 and then 4 cores that run at 2.2 or 2.7, 2.2 usually, actually, 2.2 gigahertz, for example. And this is a good way to see that even though we like to send shit to Apple, Apple actually has the best performance in this area of all the phones. We can see it on benchmarks like Geekbench and things like that. And if you want, I can do a video one day explaining why this is so, but you would have to leave it in the comments. If not, I won't do it. So, having talked about processors, having talked about all that, we have RAM and ROM. RAM it stands for Random Access Memory. When you say memory, you usually refer to RAM. Phones nowadays have everywhere from 2 to 8 gigabytes of RAM. And this is just how many apps you can have open in the background. If you press on the multitask button on whatever phone you have, you can see how many apps you have open. And if you have, for example, 8 gigabytes of RAM, you can go all the way to having, I don't know, 20 apps open at the same time, and you could go to the one you had open yesterday and it would still open. If you have a phone with 2 gigabytes of RAM, you can open maybe 5, or well, I'm being a bit too bad. Well, yes, 5, and you would go to the last one you open and it would have to recharge. So that's what RAM stands for. Then ROM is just storage, how much storage you can have. I think everyone knows what this means. Phones range from 16 to 64 or 128 or even 256 or even 512 gigabytes of storage. Sometimes I do talk about this, but I don't usually. Connectivity. I'm referring to connectivity because we have Wi-Fi and all those things are basic, everyone knows that, but for example Bluetooth can be either 4.1 or 4.2 or 5.0, which is a new one that has been implemented a short time ago with a Samsung phone. I think it was the S9, which has some advantages over other Bluetooth. So when a phone has higher range, you can connect more devices and stuff like that. So when a phone has something special like Bluetooth 5.0, then I mention it. Or it can also have NFC, or it cannot have NFC, or it can have an IR blaster, which is what you use on a normal controller, on a TV, or things like that. Or then a lot of Samsung phones have the, how do you call it? The sensor that measures your heart rate, your BPM and stuff like that. So, I don't know what else there is to talk about. Let's see. Well, obviously I do a conclusion to the video. I always talk about if all these things are good and maybe they're excellent, but they're not worth it for the price, because sometimes the price goes way over what a phone should actually cost. So this is important to have into account. It's not just having the best phone, it's having the best phone for the lowest amount of money, at least in my book. Some people don't care about the money. Some people can afford to buy just the best phone. Not my case though. So that's it, I think. I think there's not much more to talk about. So, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you liked it. And if you liked it, don't forget to leave a like down below. Don't forget to comment down below. Subscribe to the channel if you want to go on watching more videos like this. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you won't. Jesus Christ, I can't speak. So you won't miss any future videos. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.